The community pool at Riverside Estates was a crown jewel, Olympic-sized, temperature-controlled, surrounded by manicured landscaping that cost more annually than most people's cars. Marcus Chen had managed the property for 7 years, and in those 7 years, he'd learned that heaven had a dress code: $8,000 annual membership dues, proof of residency, and the patience to deal with entitled people who thought the amenities made them special. The troubles started with Victoria Hartwell. Marcus first noticed her on a Thursday in June, when summer had officially turned the sky into white-hot fury, and everyone with air conditioning problems suddenly remembered they had pool privileges. He was in his office, a converted gardening shed with one window overlooking the entire facility, when his assistant, Danny, knocked on the door looking sheepish. "We've got a situation," Danny said, which meant someone had violated the bylaws in a way Danny didn't want to report. Marcus looked up from his paperwork. At 48, he had the weathered face of someone who'd spent 2 decades dealing with other people's problems. "What kind of situation?" The gate sensors showing an unauthorized vehicle, silver Mercedes, didn't scan a resident pass, but when I went out to check, there's already people in the pool area. "Did you ask them to leave?" Danny shifted his weight. "She said she was a guest of the Hartwells. I didn't want to cause a scene with their kids there." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment. This was the paradox of his job: enforce the rules, and residents complained he was a tyrant. Don't enforce them, and chaos bloomed like mold in a damp basement. Which Hartwell residence? The corner lot, the renovated Victorian. Of course it was. The Hartwells had bought the corner lot 6 months ago and immediately spent $600,000 on renovations that the HOA had grudgingly approved because technically they met code. Victoria was the wife. Marcus had met her twice at board meetings where she'd complained about the landscaping, the pool temperature, and the lack of evening social events for residents of distinction. She'd used that exact phrase, for residents of distinction. Marcus grabbed his clipboard and walked across the manicured grounds toward the pool. It was a picture of order: 15 lounge chairs arranged in perfect rows, an umbrella marking each. Behind the glass fence, children splashed while parents reclined with drinks. And in the middle of the action, taking up a prime lounging spot, was Victoria Hartwell. She was exactly as Marcus remembered: early 50s, immaculately maintained in a way that suggested personal trainers and dermatologists, blonde hair styled into a casual perfection that took probably 45 minutes each morning. She wore a gold watch that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month. Next to her lounged 3 teenagers, presumably her children and a guest, along with another woman Marcus didn't recognize. Marcus approached with his clipboard visible. "Mrs. Hartwell." Victoria looked up from her phone with the expression of someone being interrupted during something vastly more important. "Yes. I'm going to need to see your guest pass. The system shows an unauthorized vehicle at the gate." "I'm a resident," Victoria said coolly. "My vehicle is registered." The scan shows it's the guest pass slot that wasn't activated. Typically, when a resident brings a guest, they notify us in advance so we can. "My vehicle was broken," Victoria interrupted, as though this explained everything. "Mine was in the shop. I borrowed my sister's car. Surely you don't expect me to call the HOA about borrowing a car from my own sister." Marcus had heard this particular flavor of entitlement before. The premise was always the same: rules existed for other people, for normal people, not for residents of distinction. "It's just a quick call," Marcus said, keeping his tone level. "For future reference, any guest vehicle needs advance clearance. It's in the bylaws you signed when you purchased your property." Victoria set down her phone with deliberate slowness. Around the pool, people were beginning to notice the conversation. Marcus could feel their attention like static electricity. "I've lived in this community for 6 months, Victoria said, her voice carrying the particular venom of someone used to getting her way through sheer force of personality. "In that time, I've never seen these rules enforced. I've seen plenty of residents bring guests without your approval. I've seen people using the pool who look like they might not even live here, so I'm confused about why you're standing here harassing me specifically." The word harassing landed like a stone in still water. Marcus kept his expression neutral. "I'm not harassing you, ma'am. I'm enforcing the community standards that apply to everyone equally. The bylaws don't have exceptions for." "For what?" Victoria's eyes flashed. "For what exactly were you about to say?" Marcus realized he'd walked into a trap of his own making. Whatever he said next would be twisted into evidence of his bias. He'd seen it happen 100 times in HOA disputes. For anyone, he finished, the rules apply equally to all residents. Well, the rules are stupid, Victoria said, turning back to her phone. And I don't appreciate being made to feel like a criminal for visiting the pool with my family. If you want to be taken seriously, maybe you should focus on actual problems. She dismissed him by the simple act of ignoring him. Marcus stood there for a moment, holding his clipboard, feeling the weight of neighboring eyes. Then he turned and walked back to his office. Danny was waiting when he returned. So, file it, Marcus said. No guest pass was registered, first violation. Send her a reminder about the rules. But it wasn't the first violation. Not really. It was just the first time Marcus had been forced to acknowledge it, forced to make it official instead of letting it slide, which was what everyone else did, which was how Victoria Hartwell operated. The next violation came 2 weeks later. The silver Mercedes again, this time with 2 teenagers in it. Marcus was in his office when he noticed the alert, the gate camera flagging an unauthorized vehicle. He watched the timestamp. 2:47 p.m. He watched the footage. Victoria's sister's car, but driven by someone who didn't look old enough to have a license yet. Marcus didn't go out that time. Instead, he made a note, documented it, filed it in what he was beginning to think of as the Victoria Hartwell folder. The violations accelerated through July, like a fever spiking. A pool day with a friend's family, the friend apparently so close that Victoria felt no obligation to register her in advance. An evening barbecue where the Hartwells invited 6 other residents, and 3 of them brought guests that weren't pre-approved. A Saturday morning when Marcus received a call from the main gate stating that Victoria had forgot to scan her resident pass and had asked them to just open the barrier anyway. Each violation was small, individually defensible. Collectively, they painted a picture of someone who believed the rules were suggestions and only for other people. Marcus had dealt with this before. The Karen protocol, he called it internally, the specific entitlement pattern that emerged when a homeowner community got enough wealth concentrated in the hands of people who'd never heard the word no before. The Karens didn't see themselves as breaking rules. They saw themselves as being superior to rules. Rules were for people who had to follow rules. The solution, traditionally, was to let it go, de-escalate, treat the Hartwells like VIPs and hope they eventually got bored with pushing boundaries. It was what management companies across America had learned. Enforcing rules was a liability. One angry resident on social media could torpedo a property manager's reputation. One threat of a lawyer could tie enforcement up in committees for months. Marcus knew all of this. He'd internalized it. He'd let things slide for years, watching petty violations accumulate until they became accepted practice, watching the rules become suggestions, watching the community standards dissolve into a hierarchy where some residents were simply above the guidelines. But something changed on the last Tuesday of July. Marcus was in his office when he heard shouting from the pool. He went to the window and saw his worst nightmare playing out in real time. Victoria Hartwell, absolutely furious, standing in the shallow end of the pool while her teenage daughter cried on the lounge chairs. Next to her, Mrs. Patterson, a widow, had lived in Riverside Estates for 12 years, came to the pool every day like clockwork, was standing with her arms crossed, water dripping from her shoulders. Marcus ran. By the time he reached the pool, the situation had escalated to the point where 2 other residents were filming on their phones, and one of Victoria's friends was in the water next to her, both of them yelling at Mrs. Patterson like she'd committed a crime. "What happened?" Marcus asked, making his voice the calm center of the chaos. "This woman," Victoria spat, pointing at Mrs. Patterson like she was identifying a criminal, "told my daughter she was taking up too much space on the lounge chairs. She actually moved my daughter's towel, like she had the right to touch my daughter's belongings." Mrs. Patterson, trembling slightly but holding her ground, explained what actually happened. Victoria's daughter had sprawled across 3 lounge chairs while Mrs. Patterson was trying to claim a single seat. When Victoria's daughter refused to move, Mrs. Patterson had calmly picked up her towel and moved it to another chair. A simple, dignified response to a boundary violation. "Your daughter was taking up multiple chairs," Mrs. Patterson said quietly. "I simply moved my things to—" "Don't you speak to me," Victoria cut her off, her voice turning vicious. Don't you ever speak to my daughter again. If she wants 4 chairs, she gets 4 chairs. She's more important than you are." The words hung in the humidity like a confession. Mrs. Patterson went pale. Several residents had stopped what they were doing to stare. One person lowered their phone camera. The moment stretched, terrible and clear, everyone witnessing the world according to Victoria Hartwell, a hierarchy of human worth, and she was at the top. Marcus felt something shift inside him. Not anger exactly, a kind of clarity. "Mrs. Patterson is right," he heard himself say. "Community pool rules state that lounge chairs are for individual use only. Your daughter was occupying 3 chairs. When Mrs. Patterson asked her to use one, that was appropriate. Moving a towel was appropriate. Your response was not." Victoria turned to look at him with the fury of someone who was being told she was wrong in front of an audience. "Are you seriously?" "I'm stating the facts," Marcus continued. "The rules are posted on the gate. They're in your resident handbook. They apply to everyone equally." "Everyone equally?" Victoria laughed, the sound brittle. "My family pays more in monthly assessments than half the people here. My daughter has never been spoken to like this in her entire life." "Then it's probably overdue," Marcus said quietly. The silence that followed was the most honest moment Riverside Estates had experienced in years. Around the pool, other residents stopped pretending to be distracted. They watched, some with shock, some with something that looked like gratitude. Victoria Hartwell's face went red. "This is discrimination. This is harassment. I will be calling my lawyer and I will be filing a formal complaint with the board. This man," she pointed at Marcus, "has it out for my family. This is vendetta-based enforcement." "No," Marcus said, "this is accountability." The way it happened next was faster than anyone expected. Victoria stormed out of the pool with her daughter and friends in tow, promising lawsuits and complaints and ruin. She left her towels. She left her umbrella. She left behind a wake of upset that took the lifeguard another hour to talk down. That evening, Marcus knew she would start making calls. She would contact other residents, spinning the narrative. She would reach out to the HOA board. She would threaten legal action. She would do all the things that the Karens did when they encountered resistance. He also knew that he'd finally stopped playing the game. The violation would come next. It always did. Not a small one this time. Something designed to prove that the rules were meaningless, that Victoria Hartwell existed above them, that Marcus Chen was just a petty tyrant who should be put in his place. What Marcus didn't know yet was what that violation would look like, or how it would force him to make a choice that would change everything. Not just for him, but for everyone in Riverside Estates who'd ever been made to feel small by someone who believed the rules didn't apply to them. He stood in his office as the sun set, watching the pool empty out. Mrs. Patterson had stayed until the end, a quiet act of defiance. The other residents had, one by one, resumed their evening as if nothing had happened, but something had shifted. The old order, the unspoken agreement that enforcement was optional for the right people, had been disrupted. It was aggressive in the way that rich people's lawyers could be aggressive, all confidence and threats wrapped up in formal language. The complaint alleged that Marcus Chen was engaging in discriminatory practices, selective enforcement, harassment, and violations of community standards. It suggested that Mrs. Patterson had been weaponized against the Hartwell family. It hinted that racial or socioeconomic bias might be involved, though not explicitly enough to commit to the accusation. What it actually proved was that Victoria Hartwell understood the system perfectly. She knew that even a baseless threat of discrimination would trigger an investigation. She knew that the board would be forced to consider her complaint, not because it had merit, but because ignoring it could expose the HOA to liability. She knew that the burden would shift. Instead of her proving she'd broken rules, Marcus would have to prove he hadn't discriminated in enforcing them. The HOA board called an emergency meeting for the following Tuesday. Marcus had been on the board himself for 2 years before stepping back to focus on his management duties, so he knew how these things worked. Janet Morrison was the board president this year, a retired software engineer with a background in systems analysis and zero patience for political maneuvering. She was the one person on the board who might actually care about fairness. The other 4 board members were a mix of typical HOA types. A retired investment banker who viewed everything through a profitability lens, 2 residents who'd been on the board so long they were basically furniture, and a relatively new resident who was trying to prove something. The meeting was held in the community center, in a room with floor-to-ceiling windows and a conference table that looked like it had been assembled by someone who thought larger meant more authoritative. Marcus sat on one side of it. Victoria Hartwell sat on the other with her lawyer, a thin man in an expensive suit with the kind of face that probably charged $300 an hour just for looking sympathetic. Janet opened the meeting with her characteristic directness. "Let me be clear about what we're here to determine. Mrs. Hartwell has filed a complaint alleging selective enforcement against Mr. Chen. Mr. Chen has a duty to enforce community standards according to the bylaws. Our job is to determine whether his enforcement was discriminatory or whether he was following protocol. Mrs. Hartwell, why don't you start by explaining your complaint?" Victoria's lawyer cleared his throat. "Thank you. Mrs. Hartwell and her family have been residents of Riverside Estates for 6 months. In that time, Mr. Chen has consistently targeted her family with enforcement actions while ignoring similar violations by other residents. For instance," he pulled out a folder and laid out photographs. Drone footage from the pool showing various infractions, 3 residents with multiple lounge chairs, a group that looked like it included non-residents, a barbecue where clearly more than 6 people were gathered in a resident's private space. "These violations," the lawyer continued, "have either not been reported or not been enforced. Yet when Mrs. Hartwell's family engaged in similar behavior, immediate enforcement actions were taken. This suggests bias." Marcus felt his jaw clench. The lawyer was good. He was making it look damning, even though the photographs were taken out of context, even though they didn't show dates or circumstances. The board members were already making neutral faces, the universal expression of people trying not to show which way they were leaning. "Those photographs," Marcus said, keeping his voice level, "are missing dates and context. They're designed to look equivalent when they're not. More importantly, they don't address the actual sequence of events." "Would you like to walk us through it?" Janet asked. Marcus did. He went through each Victoria violation chronologically: the unauthorized vehicle, the guest with no prior registration, the pool incident with Mrs. Patterson. Each violation, individually small enough to be overlooked, but collectively demonstrating a pattern of boundary testing that escalated when not met with resistance. "I didn't target Mrs. Hartwell," Marcus explained. "I responded to her violations of community standards. The first time I addressed an issue, she became hostile. The violations then accelerated. That's not selective enforcement, that's a resident testing whether the rules applied to her." "But you haven't documented similar enforcement against other residents," Victoria's lawyer interjected. "That's the point. You could have enforced these rules systematically. Instead, you chose to enforce them against my client." Janet leaned forward. "Actually, Mr. Chen, do you have documentation of enforcement actions against other residents?" This was the trap. The system was designed so that if you enforced rules fairly, everyone got caught eventually. But if you documented it thoroughly, you created a paper trail that proved you were targeting specific people. If you didn't document it, you created a gap that could be interpreted as bias. "I have records of violations," Marcus said, "but I also have discretion about enforcement. The community bylaws give management authority to determine whether violations warrant formal action. I've been managing this property for 7 years. In most cases, a warning is sufficient. The pattern with Mrs. Hartwell was different because the warnings didn't work." "So you admit you have discretion," Victoria's lawyer said, "and that discretion led you to take formal enforcement action against my client while not taking such action against others. That's selective enforcement." "That's not what I said," Marcus replied. "I said I have discretion to determine whether violations warrant formal action. I exercise that discretion based on the pattern of behavior, not the individual." But even as he said it, he knew how it sounded. He was using the language of fairness while admitting to the tools of unfairness. In a system designed to be ambiguous, his good intentions could be framed as discrimination by someone who knew how to manipulate the language. Janet was watching him carefully. "Mr. Chen, would you be willing to implement a formal enforcement protocol to remove the discretion element entirely?" This was the escape hatch, the thing that would make the complaint go away. Implement formal rules for documentation and enforcement, prove you were doing it systematically, and the accusation of bias would evaporate. But Marcus also understood what implementing formal enforcement would actually mean. It would mean that Victoria Hartwell, who had successfully weaponized the accusation of discrimination, would win. It would mean that the system had been successfully bent to her will, because she was the one who'd forced them all to have this conversation, who'd made the threat that only formal, rigid enforcement could address. It would mean that from now on, the rules would be enforced like they applied equally to everyone, which was theoretically fair, but which meant that the wealthy and connected could continue to violate them with confidence, knowing that management couldn't afford the liability of selective enforcement. Yes, Marcus heard himself say, I'd be willing to implement formal enforcement protocols. He hated himself for saying it, but he knew it was the smart move, the safe move, the move that wouldn't get him sued. Janet nodded. Then I propose we table Mrs. Hartwell's complaint, implement a formal enforcement system going forward, and consider this matter resolved. All in favor. All 5 board members voted yes. It took 90 seconds. After the meeting, Victoria's lawyer extended his hand to Marcus like they'd done business together. Marcus didn't shake it. He watched Victoria exit the conference room with the satisfied expression of someone who just discovered that the system would protect her as long as she understood how to threaten it. In the parking lot, Janet caught up with him. That was the right call, she said quietly. I know it doesn't feel like it. Does it feel like it was the right call to you? Marcus asked. No, Janet admitted. But it's the call that keeps you employed and the community out of court. Sometimes those are the same thing, sometimes they're not. Marcus didn't respond. He drove home to his small apartment on the edge of the community, the property manager's residence that came with his job, close enough to respond to emergencies, far enough to feel separate from the residents he served. He sat on his balcony as the sun set and considered what had just happened. The system had worked perfectly. It had taken an accusation of bias and transformed it into a requirement for rigid enforcement. It had taken a threat of litigation and turned it into policy. It had taken a dishonest complaint and created consequences for the person who tried to call out dishonesty. Victoria Hartwell had won, not in the way she probably meant to, but she'd won. Marcus poured himself a drink and tried not to think about what that meant, but he couldn't stop thinking about it. By Thursday, he'd made a decision. The decision was stupid. Marcus knew this with the clarity of someone contemplating something that would probably ruin his life. But knowing it was stupid and not doing it anyway was how you ended up living with regret for the rest of your existence. Marcus had a drone. He'd bought it years ago, back when drones were still a novelty, thinking he might do aerial property surveys or get dramatic footage for the community website. He'd never actually used it for that. The thing sat in his apartment closet, expensive and forgotten, collecting dust. On Friday morning, Marcus took it out. The drone was a high-end model with a 4K camera and extended range. He'd kept the batteries charged out of habit. He flew it up over the community, the pool area first, the clubhouse, the tennis courts, the walking paths. The footage was gorgeous, cinematic in a way that made the wealthy community look like a resort in a travel magazine. Then he started recording violations. He set the drone to hover above the pool area during busy times. He captured footage of residents taking up multiple lounge chairs. He recorded what looked like non-residents in the pool area. He documented barbecues and gatherings that probably exceeded community size limits. He wasn't targeted in his documentation. He was random. He just flew the drone whenever he had time, whenever the community looked like it had gatherings, whenever the pool was busy. He saved every file. He organized them by date and time. And then he waited. It took 2 weeks. Victoria Hartwell arrived at the pool on a Saturday morning with her sister's silver Mercedes, her 3 children, and 2 additional teenagers who didn't appear to be residents. Marcus had the drone already in the air. He watched through the drone's camera as Victoria set up an expansive setup. 4 lounge chairs in a commanding position, coolers, umbrellas, a premium lounging zone. He watched as she treated the pool area like she owned it, as her children splashed and her friends laughed, and the other residents navigated around her like water around a rock. And he recorded everything. For 2 hours, the drone captured high-quality footage from multiple angles. Crystal clear, timestamps embedded, no ambiguity. When Victoria finally left, Marcus landed the drone and transferred the files to his laptop. He stared at the footage for a long time, sitting in his apartment, the weight of what he'd just done settling on him like fog. He wasn't going to turn it in immediately. He was going to wait. He was going to let Victoria believe she'd won. He was going to let her grow comfortable in her victory, let her believe that the system had validated her approach, let her relax into the certainty that rules didn't apply to her. And then, when the moment was right, he was going to prove her wrong in a way she would never recover from. Marcus told himself this was about justice, about accountability, about showing that the rules meant something. But there was something else underneath that reasoning, something darker. There was spite. There was the specific fury of someone who'd been forced to bend the system to accommodate someone else's entitlement. There was a desire to make sure Victoria Hartwell understood, really understood, that her victory had an expiration date. He'd just become something he hadn't intended to become. He'd become the kind of person who waits for revenge with the patience of someone who understands that the best comeuppance is the one you see coming too late to stop. The footage accumulated through August like a prosecutor building a case. Marcus continued to fly the drone during peak pool hours and community gatherings. He was systematic about it, random enough that no pattern was obvious to anyone watching, but consistent enough that he captured the violations he was specifically looking for. He told himself he was documenting all violations equally, which was technically true, even though his focus was definitely, intentionally tilted toward the Hartwell family. The drone became his obsession. He'd watch the footage in his apartment at night, cataloging violations, timestamps, participants. He created a spreadsheet. He cross-referenced with HOA records. He even created a comparison chart, all violations by Victoria's family, all violations by other residents, to prove or disprove he wasn't sure anymore whether his enforcement had actually been discriminatory. The numbers were interesting. Victoria's family accounted for 23% of documented violations despite being one of 96 households. They were, statistically, the most consistent rule breakers on the property. But they were also, Marcus was forced to admit, being documented by him more carefully than anyone else was. His objectivity was compromised. His case could be torn apart in seconds by anyone who understood that the person conducting surveillance has a stake in the results. But that was okay, Marcus told himself. The evidence was still real, the violations still happened, the documentation was still accurate. What he didn't tell himself was why he cared so much, why he couldn't let this go. On a Tuesday in mid-August, Victoria visited the pool with her husband, David, for the first time all summer. David was a different type of entitled, quiet in a way that suggested the entitlement was so fundamental he didn't need to perform it. He was a corporate executive at some firm downtown, the kind of person who made significantly more money than Victoria and therefore treated community pool rules like they were things other people followed. They brought their 3 children and a teenager Marcus didn't recognize. They set up in Victoria's usual spot, 4 lounge chairs arranged like a throne room, coolers, umbrellas, the works. Marcus had the drone already positioned. He watched through the camera as David did something that made Marcus's jaw clench. He took a lounge chair that Mrs. Patterson had left her towel on, she was in the water, swimming laps, and moved it to join his family's zone. He moved Mrs. Patterson's towel to the ground and took her chair. Marcus watched as Mrs. Patterson got out of the pool, saw what had happened, and quietly moved her towel and belongings to another area without saying anything. She was used to being moved. She was used to accommodating other people's entitlement. Marcus had the drone positioned perfectly. He captured David's face, clearly identifiable as he moved the chair. He captured Victoria laughing next to him. He captured Mrs. Patterson's quiet acceptance of this small humiliation and the resolution on her face as she set up in a less desirable spot. The footage was incriminating. It was also, from a certain angle, just a guy moving a lounge chair. But in context, in the documented context of an entire community of people protecting someone else's boundary violations, it was proof of a pattern. That evening, Marcus received a call from Janet Morrison. "How's the formal enforcement protocol going?" she asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer. "Fine," Marcus said. "I've been documenting violations across the board." "Good, because I just got a call from David Hartwell. He's threatening to sue the HOA for discrimination. Apparently, he moved a lounge chair today and thinks it's being treated as a violation despite other residents doing similar things." Marcus's stomach dropped. Did he file a formal complaint? Not yet, but his tone suggested it's coming. He seems to think someone was surveilling the pool. He mentioned something about a drone. Of course, David had seen the drone. The Hartwells weren't stupid. They were just entitled in a way that made them underestimate people they considered service workers. I was documenting violations, Marcus said carefully. The board approved formal documentation protocols. Using a drone? Janet's voice had taken on a careful quality. The kind of careful that suggested she was already running liability scenarios in her head. The drone is an efficient way to capture multiple angles of public spaces. Is it? Janet said. The word hung in the air, loaded with all the legal implications of surveillance in a private community. Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you're surveilling specific residents using aerial photography equipment without their consent. That might be legal. It might also be the kind of thing that makes our insurance company very unhappy and our lawyer very busy. Marcus felt the trap close. Of course, it felt surveillance-like. It was surveillance. He'd been gathering evidence against specific people, and now that evidence was usable against him. I was documenting public pool activity, Marcus said. The pool is a common area. Anyone can observe activity there. Anyone can observe, Janet agreed. But can they document via drone for extended periods? That's a different question, one that I suspect a lawyer would have very different opinions about depending on whose check he's cashing. Mr. Chen, I'm going to need you to stop the drone surveillance immediately, and I'm going to need you to delete any footage that specifically targets individual residents. I've been documenting all residents, Marcus said, but even he could hear the defensiveness in his tone. You've been documenting with your focus heavily tilted toward one family. I'm not blind, and I'm going to guess neither is David Hartwell, which is why he called to complain about being surveilled. So here's what happens next. You stop the drone, you delete the footage, and we move forward with standard documentation only. No aerial photography, no targeted surveillance. Understood. Understood, Marcus said, though understanding and agreeing were not the same thing. Good, because the last thing this community needs is a lawsuit from someone wealthy enough to make it expensive and connected enough to make it public. The Hartwells are already threatening social media campaigns. We don't need to give them ammunition. After Janet hung up, Marcus sat in his apartment with the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him like physical force. The drone footage he'd so carefully collected was now liability. The evidence he'd gathered so meticulously was now the thing that made him look like the problem. He transferred the footage files to an external hard drive and considered his options. Janet had told him to delete the footage. She'd been clear about that. She'd also been clear that her instruction was coming from a place of institutional self-protection, not from a place of concern for what was right. Marcus understood the calculation they were making. He was a single employee. The Hartwells were lawsuit-wealthy residents. The choice was obvious from a business perspective. What Marcus didn't understand was how he was supposed to accept this. How he was supposed to watch the Hartwells walk around knowing that he'd seen them violate the rules and done nothing. How he was supposed to let Victoria's smug victory stand. He opened his laptop and looked at the footage one more time. David moving Mrs. Patterson's chair. Victoria laughing. The casual cruelty of people who believed the world bent to accommodate them. Then Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He didn't delete the footage. Instead, he uploaded it, not to the HOA records, but to the community Facebook page under a fake account. Just a few clips, really. Nothing that revealed his identity as the source. Just high-quality aerial footage of the Hartwell family at the pool, with timestamps and dates visible, engaging in activities that violated community standards. He included a message. I'm tired of watching certain residents get special treatment while others follow the rules. These violations have been documented and reported to management, but nothing gets done. I thought the community should know what's actually happening at our pool. The post reached critical mass by 9 a.m. Wednesday morning. By 10 a.m., it had been shared in the community's WhatsApp groups and private chat channels. By noon, someone had identified the footage as being taken by an aerial drone and started speculating about who had access to that kind of equipment. By 1 p.m., the post had been screenshot and shared to multiple neighborhood social media groups outside of Riverside Estates. By 2 p.m., Janet Morrison had called an emergency board meeting. Marcus arrived at the community center knowing that his career was probably over. He also knew that he didn't care as much as he probably should have. There was a strange relief in finally being honest about what he'd done, even if he was currently denying it to everyone's face. The board was assembled, along with David Hartwell's lawyer, a different one, more expensive-looking, and David Hartwell himself. Victoria wasn't there, which seemed significant. David was the one angry enough to act, while Victoria was likely somewhere having her lawyer advise her on how to best weaponize this violation for maximum impact. Janet opened the meeting with barely controlled fury. A video was posted to the community Facebook page at 11:47 last night. It contains aerial drone footage of residents at the community pool, filmed without their knowledge or consent. The footage was clearly filmed to specifically document the Hartwell family. Mr. Hartwell is here because he believes this constitutes illegal surveillance and harassment. I want to know right now, did you film that footage, Mr. Chen? Every instinct Marcus had screamed at him to lie, to deny, to suggest that other people had access to drones, to create reasonable doubt. But something had shifted inside him. Maybe it was the cumulative effect of bending his integrity to accommodate people like the Hartwells. Maybe it was the specific exhaustion of pretending that discrimination wasn't happening while accommodating it. Maybe it was just that he was tired of being afraid. Yes, Marcus said, I filmed the footage. The room went very still. You what? Janet's voice had taken on a dangerous quality. I filmed the aerial footage using a personal drone, Marcus said clearly. I documented rule violations by multiple residents, including the Hartwell family. When management declined to act on that documentation, I posted a selection of that footage to the community page to inform residents about violations that weren't being addressed. You surveilled residents without their consent, David Hartwell's lawyer said immediately, his tone suggesting victory. I recorded activity in a public common space, Marcus replied. Anyone can use the pool. Everyone knows the pool is in plain sight. I didn't record anything private. You used surveillance equipment specifically to target my clients, the lawyer continued. You weaponized that surveillance to damage their reputation by posting it publicly. That's harassment. That's potentially defamation. It's also evidence that they violated community rules, Marcus interrupted. Which is what I posted. I didn't say anything false. I didn't manipulate the footage. I showed what happened. Unethically, the lawyer spat. In violation of privacy expectations. Privacy expectations. Marcus felt something sharp and hot rise up in him. What about Mrs. Patterson's expectations? What about her expectation that she wouldn't have her lounge chair stolen by a resident who thinks rules don't apply to him? What about her privacy expectation when she was moving through her own community without being made to feel like she didn't belong? Janet was watching him carefully. Mr. Chen, I understand your frustration, but what you've done is effective, Marcus finished. Is that what you're looking for? The word is effective. I documented violations. I reported them through proper channels. When nothing happened, I presented the evidence to the community. And now the community knows what the Hartwells have been doing. The community also knows that management is conducting surveillance operations, Janet countered. Do you understand what that does to confidence in this HOA? Do you understand what it does to liability insurance? Do you understand what it does to our legal standing when you, as a management employee, engage in targeted surveillance of specific residents? I understand, Marcus said, that if I'd continued to follow the rules, nothing would have changed. Victoria would still believe she's above the standards that everyone else follows. David would still be moving other residents' belongings without consequence, and Mrs. Patterson would still be made to feel small in her own community. I understand that playing by the system's rules meant accepting injustice, so I played by different rules. David Hartwell's lawyer was already making notes, already composing the legal arguments. This entire conversation is admission of targeting, surveillance, and public defamation. We'll be filing suit against Mr. Chen personally and against the HOA for negligent oversight. The damages would include. But Marcus wasn't listening anymore. He was looking at Janet, and he was looking at the other board members, and he was seeing them calculate the cost of supporting him versus the cost of throwing him under the bus. He was watching them do the math and arrive at the obvious answer. I'm resigning, Marcus said quietly. The room made a collective sound. Surprise, relief, resignation, depending on who was doing the expressing. Mr. Chen, Janet started. Effective immediately, Marcus continued. I'll document the property status, hand over all files, and vacate the premises within 2 weeks. You can give the Hartwells whatever apology and compensation you think is necessary. I won't contest it." He stood up. The meeting had been scheduled for an hour. He'd been there for 9 minutes. "You're making a mistake," David Hartwell's lawyer called out as Marcus left the room. "Without a resignation, we would have had to work within HOA protections." But Marcus was already gone. He spent the walk back to his apartment with his phone buzzing constantly. Texts from residents who'd seen the footage. Calls from people identifying themselves as journalists or community advocates. Messages from Mrs. Patterson, from other residents who said his post had made them feel vindicated, from people who thanked him for finally doing something about the special treatment. There were also messages telling him he was a stalker, a vigilante, a villain who abused his position of power. There were messages from residents defending the Hartwells, saying they were being attacked by a vindictive employee, that this kind of harassment was inappropriate. The community had fractured along predictable lines, those who benefited from lax enforcement versus those who suffered from it. By evening, a local news outlet had picked up the story. "HOA manager uses surveillance drone to target wealthy residents," read the headline. By morning, it had expanded. Tensions escalated upscale community over selective rule enforcement. The Hartwells hired additional lawyers. They filed suit against Marcus personally for harassment and defamation. They threatened to sue the HOA for creating an environment where surveillance was possible. They appeared on local news looking wounded, explaining how they'd been unfairly targeted by a vindictive management employee. And then something unexpected happened. Mrs. Patterson went on local news, too. She was quiet and measured in a way that made the Hartwells' performance look shrill. She explained calmly that she'd been moved from a lounge chair without asking. She described what it felt like to be made to feel like an unwelcome guest in a community she'd lived in for 12 years. She said, very simply and very clearly, that Mr. Chen had been right to enforce rules that applied to everyone equally. Then she said something that changed the entire trajectory. "I'm 73 years old. I come to this pool because it's my community. When someone moves my things and treats me like I don't matter, it's not just about a chair. It's about being made to feel disposable in a place that's supposed to be mine." That quote went viral. It appeared in the regional news. It was shared in community groups across the country. It became the emotional counterweight to the Hartwells' legal assault. Because suddenly, this wasn't about whether surveillance drones were ethical. It was about whether wealthy people should be allowed to treat other residents as servants. It was about whether the rules meant anything at all. The Hartwells' social media accounts filled with hostile comments from strangers. Their lawyer's office got calls they didn't answer. 3 other residents began documenting their own violations by other residents and started asking why they weren't getting the same special treatment. By the end of the week, the narrative had flipped. The Hartwells weren't victims anymore. They were villains. The community wasn't rallying around them, it was rallying against them. But the cost of that flip was Marcus's job, his apartment, his position in the community he'd spent 7 years building. On his last day, Marcus packed his belongings from the property manager's office. Janet came by to say an awkward goodbye. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think you were right about the enforcing. I just wish you'd done it within the system instead of against it." "The system was designed not to enforce against people like the Hartwells," Marcus replied. "You knew that. Everyone knew that." "That's true," Janet admitted. "But now you're the problem person instead of the person solving problems. That's not nothing." After she left, Marcus sat alone in his empty office and considered this. He'd started with the intention of holding the Hartwells accountable. He'd ended with the reputation of someone who'd abused his position of power to target residents he had a grudge against. Both things were true, and neither one canceled out the other. He was leaving behind a community that was fractured, a management position that was now under scrutiny, and a legal mess that would probably take months to resolve. He was also leaving behind a community that had finally been forced to confront the reality of selective enforcement, to acknowledge that the rules either applied to everyone or they applied to no one. 2 weeks later, Marcus had a new apartment 10 miles away and a job interview lined up at a different property management company. The Hartwells had filed suit for $2.3 million in damages. The HOA had hired an external auditor to review all past enforcement decisions. Mrs. Patterson had been contacted by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell the story of selective rule enforcement in wealthy communities. And then, on a Tuesday morning, Marcus got a call from Janet. "You need to see something," she said. "Can you come back to the community?" He shouldn't have gone back. He knew it was a bad idea. But curiosity has teeth, and Marcus's teeth had been aching since he left. Janet met him at the community center. She had a laptop and a serious expression. "After you left, we did a comprehensive audit of enforcement decisions over the past 7 years," Janet explained. "We were trying to document that we'd been consistent with enforcement, partly to defend against the Hartwells' harassment claims, partly to understand what had actually been going on here." She opened a spreadsheet, rows and rows of enforcement decisions, violations, warnings, formal actions, a complete history of every rule break that management had documented. "What you did was worse than you probably realized," Janet said, and Marcus's stomach dropped. But then she continued, "And what you did was necessary." She pulled up a chart. It showed enforcement action by resident wealth level. The correlation was stark. Violations by residents in lower-priced homes were documented and enforced at a rate of 78%. Violations by residents in the premium lots, the ones worth $1.2 million and up, were documented and enforced at a rate of 12%. "That's not selective discrimination," Janet said quietly. "That's systemic discrimination built into how management has been operating, and nobody noticed because it wasn't being done consciously. The property managers before you were just responding to social pressure. People with more money complain louder, so their violations got overlooked. It was institutional bias rather than personal bias, but the effect is the same." "Why are you showing me this?" Marcus asked. "Because the Hartwells filed a countersuit against the HOA for discriminatory practices," Janet said. "They claim that you were specifically targeting them while ignoring violations by other residents. The only defense we have is to prove that you were actually documenting violations across all residents, and that enforcement was consistent." "But it wasn't consistent," Marcus said. "That's the whole problem." "Exactly," Janet said. "So the HOA is going to have to admit to discriminatory practices, apologize to residents who were unfairly targeted, and implement new oversight protocols. We're also going to have to settle the Hartwells' claims for a lower amount than they wanted, because proving systematic discrimination against lower-income residents isn't a good look." Marcus felt the irony like a punch to the chest. "So by documenting the Hartwells' violations, I inadvertently proved that the entire system was biased against everyone else." "Not inadvertently," Janet said. "You proved it deliberately, you just didn't know what you were proving." She pulled up another file. "There's more. The documentary filmmaker contacted us because she wanted access to our records. In reviewing those records, she found something interesting. The Hartwells' lawyer, David's lawyer, he was demanding that we provide documentation of all enforcement against residents, presumably to prove that we were selective in targeting his clients. But when we pulled all enforcement records, we found that David Hartwell's own company has been sued multiple times for labor practice violations. His company has been cited for workplace discrimination. He has a history of using lawyers to intimidate people and organizations into settling rather than fighting." "What are you saying?" Marcus asked. "I'm saying that you chose the right target, even if you did it for the wrong reasons. The Hartwells aren't just entitled residents breaking pool rules. They're people who use their wealth and legal resources to avoid accountability for everything. You just happen to be the first person willing to document it and make it visible." Marcus sat with this for a moment. "What does this mean for the lawsuit?" "It means we're countersuing," Janet said. "We're filing suit against the Hartwells for harassment, abuse of legal process, and retaliation against an employee for enforcing community standards. We're using the documentation you gathered as evidence of their pattern of violation. And we're going to drag this thing through depositions and discovery until they either settle for a fraction of their claim or we expose them publicly as serial offenders." "You're using my drone footage," Marcus said, "which you told me to delete." "We're using it as evidence of your diligence in documentation," Janet corrected, "which shows that you were doing your job thoroughly, not discriminating. Yes, we're hypocrites. Welcome to how institutions actually work." Marcus should have felt vindicated. Instead, he felt tired. "The other thing," Janet continued, "is that we want to offer you your job back, with a promotion to Director of Community Standards. with explicit authority to enforce rules consistently and without exception, with the board's full support behind you. "Why would you do that?" Marcus asked. "I'm a liability. I'm the person who used a surveillance drone to target residents. I'm the person who posted evidence on social media. I'm the person who caused this entire mess." "Because you did the job that nobody else was willing to do," Janet said. "You held the line. And yes, you did it unethically, and yes, you did it in a way that exposed the HOA to legal risk, but you did it. You forced us to confront the reality that we were playing favorites, and now the entire system is going to change because of what you did." Marcus left Riverside Estates that day without accepting the job offer. But he didn't decline it either. He asked for time to think, knowing that he probably wouldn't take it, knowing that going back would feel like accepting that the system could be reformed from the inside, which he wasn't sure he believed anymore. Over the next month, the story continued to unfold in ways that Marcus couldn't have predicted. The HOA settled with the Hartwells for $800,000, a fraction of their initial claim. David Hartwell's company faced additional lawsuits from former employees who, inspired by Mrs. Patterson's public support, came forward with their own stories of retaliation and harassment. The documentary filmmaker decided to shift focus from the HOA to David Hartwell himself, turning it into an investigation of how wealthy people use legal threats to silence accountability. The Hartwells began talking about moving to a different community. There were rumors about them reconsidering their position, about Victoria's fury at her husband's legal strategy, about the relationship fracturing under the pressure of being publicly exposed as bullies. Mrs. Patterson started a neighborhood association focused on community standards and fair enforcement. Within 3 months, she had 43 residents signed on. She began documenting violations herself, not with drones, but with careful documentation and photographs. She created a culture where accountability was expected and enforced equally. And Marcus watched all of this from his new job at a different property management company, wondering whether he'd been a catalyst for change or just a convenient excuse for people to finally acknowledge problems they'd been choosing to ignore. The final act came 6 months later in March, when Marcus received a letter from Mrs. Patterson. Inside was a photograph. It showed Riverside Estates' community pool during spring break. Lounge chairs arranged neatly in rows, each with a single occupant, residents of all demographics and income levels sharing the space equally. No one hoarding multiple chairs. No one claiming territory that wasn't theirs. Just a community pool functioning according to the rules that applied to everyone. Below the photograph, Mrs. Patterson had written, "I wanted you to know how it worked out. I know you can't see the details from the picture, but I can tell you that the pool is running better than it ever has. Not because we have more rules, but because everyone follows the same ones." David and Victoria left in January. They rented out their house to a young family who follows the guidelines and who actually participated in the community instead of ruling it. They've had to pay a settlement, and I heard through the grapevine that David's company is facing serious problems because of all the lawsuits that came out once people stopped being afraid to speak up. Victoria has apparently hired a therapist. I don't know if that's because of the fallout or if it's just coincidence, but I thought you'd want to know. Most importantly, I wanted to thank you. I know you paid a price for holding that line, but you should know that it mattered. It actually mattered. Marcus read the letter 3 times. Then he placed it in a drawer with his other important documents. The kind of thing you keep not because you need to remember it, but because you need proof that it happened, that it was real, that something you did actually changed the world, however small that world was. His new job was at a larger property management company that handled 5 communities across the state. The experience at Riverside Estates had given him a reputation. Some people called him a hero. Some called him a troublemaker, but everyone knew his name. He used that reputation to advocate for consistent enforcement policies, for systematic documentation that prevented discrimination, for accountability that applied equally to all residents regardless of their wealth or influence. He wasn't going to change the world. He wasn't even going to change the property management industry. But he could change individual communities. He could set systems up so that the next time someone tried to use wealth as immunity from rules, there would be documentation, evidence, and community support for holding them accountable. The Hartwell story became a case study in how institutional bias functions even without explicit discrimination. Business schools started using the HOA's enforcement data as an example of systemic inequality. Documentaries featured Mrs. Patterson talking about what it felt like to be made to feel small in a community she'd lived in for over a decade. Victoria Hartwell deleted her social media accounts and largely disappeared from public view. David Hartwell's company restructured under new management after several board members distanced themselves from his leadership. They kept their rental property in Riverside Estates, but they almost never visited. The young family that rented from them sent Christmas cards to the community center. They didn't move the lounge chairs. They didn't claim territory that wasn't theirs. They participated in the community like everyone else. The HOA eventually hired Marcus back, but not as property manager. They created a new position, Director of Community Equity, specifically designed to prevent the kind of systemic discrimination that had been operating below the surface for years. He took the job. The first thing he did was implement a blind enforcement system. Violations were documented without identifying the resident initially. Enforcement decisions were made based on violations rather than perpetrators, and all decisions were reviewed by a committee that included residents from different income brackets. It wasn't perfect. No system is, but it was better. It was fairer. It made it much harder for wealth to create immunity from accountability. Janet Morrison, who'd been on the board when everything happened, ran for president of the HOA and won. She implemented new oversight protocols and made transparency a priority. The community started publishing enforcement data quarterly so residents could see that rules were actually being applied consistently. 3 years after the drone footage went viral, Riverside Estates became a case study in how to fix systemic discrimination in HOA enforcement. Other communities started reaching out, asking for help implementing similar systems. Marcus found himself conducting trainings and consulting for property management companies across the country, helping them identify and correct the blind spots in their enforcement practices. The money from the Hartwell settlement was distributed partly as restitution to residents who'd been unfairly targeted by inconsistent enforcement, and partly toward community improvements. Mrs. Patterson served on the committee that decided how to allocate it. She insisted that some of it go toward scholarships for children of residents who couldn't afford to live in Riverside Estates, toward making the community more economically diverse instead of just wealthy. On the first anniversary of Mrs. Patterson's letter, Marcus visited the pool at Riverside Estates. He didn't work there anymore, but he could still access the community to check on how the new systems were functioning. The pool was crowded on a Saturday morning, families, couples, retirees. He watched people find chairs and respect the boundaries. He watched residents who weren't wealthy interact with residents who were, without resentment or special treatment. He watched a child accidentally spill a juice box on an expensive lounge chair, and the owner laugh it off instead of making the child feel terrible. It was a small thing, a community pool functioning according to its actual rules instead of according to invisible hierarchies. But small things, Marcus had learned, matter more than we usually acknowledge. Mrs. Patterson found him standing by the fence. "I didn't know you were coming," she said, smiling. "Checking on the new system," Marcus said. "How's it working from your perspective?" "Better than I expected," Mrs. Patterson admitted. "You know what the best part is? It's not about enforcement, it's about clarity. When everyone knows the rules apply to them, people actually follow the rules. There's not this sense of injustice that builds up when some people get special treatment. It's just fair." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the pool, watching the community. "I was thinking about what you did," Mrs. Patterson said eventually. "Using the drone to document violations, that was the wrong way to do it. You know that, right?" "I know," Marcus said. "But it was also the only way that worked," Mrs. Patterson continued. "Because the right way, going through the system, filing complaints, waiting for enforcement, the right way just gets absorbed and processed and filed away. The right way doesn't actually change anything. Sometimes you have to break the rules to prove that rules matter." "And what do you think about that?" Marcus asked. "I think," Mrs. Patterson said carefully, "that it's complicated. I think you paid too high a price. I think you could have destroyed your life and nobody would have cared. And I also think that if you hadn't done something radical, nothing would have changed at all. So I think you made a choice that was wrong and necessary, and I'm grateful for it even though I wish you hadn't had to make it." Marcus had thought about this a lot over the years. The cost-benefit analysis of his decision, whether violating the ethical guidelines in pursuit of justice made him a hero or a villain or both. He'd never come up with a satisfying answer. But he'd come to understand that maybe that was okay. Maybe the world was complicated enough that the most important moments didn't come with clear moral categories. Maybe doing the right thing sometimes meant doing the wrong thing. Maybe integrity was just making sure you understood the difference. As the sun set over Riverside Estates, Marcus watched the pool empty out. Families headed home. Couples packed up their things. The lounge chairs were returned to their racks, one chair per resident, no hoarding, no hierarchy. The rules applied to everyone. Victoria Hartwell wasn't special because she was wealthy. Mrs. Patterson wasn't invisible because she was older. David Hartwell didn't own the right to move other people's things without asking. The system had been corrected. The community had been fixed. And the cost, Marcus's career at Riverside Estates, his reputation, the legal battles, the public humiliation, was paid and documented and part of the historical record. In his office at his new company, Marcus kept 2 photographs. One was of Riverside Estates pool in its new, corrected state. The other was of the drone footage that had started everything. Victoria with her 4 lounge chairs, her family, her assumption that the rules were for other people. He kept them as reminders that justice doesn't always look like justice, that the right answer sometimes requires doing the wrong thing, that accountability, when it finally arrives, can transform communities and lives in ways nobody predicts. And that sometimes, the only way to prove that rules matter is to break them.